What if everything you were taught about human history is incomplete? What if the story of civilization does not begin where textbooks say it does, but far earlier, buried beneath layers of erased time, forgotten worlds, and deliberate silence? Before you relax, before your mind drifts into that calm, slow rhythm of sleep, let me ask you something unsettling. What if we are not the first advanced civilization on this planet, but the seventh? For most of us, history feels solid, linear. Cavemen, agriculture, cities, empires, modern society. A clean progression that reassures us that humanity is constantly moving forward. But there is another narrative, one that whispers through ancient ruins, forbidden texts, submerged cities, and myths that refuse to die. A narrative suggesting that civilization does not move in a straight line, but in cycles: rise, advance, disappear, reset. Tonight, as you listen, allow yourself to imagine a world before memory. A world that reached heights of knowledge and power long before our own. A civilization that mastered stone, energy, geometry, perhaps even consciousness itself. And then imagine that world being erased, not slowly forgotten, but wiped away, by catastrophe, by design, or by forces far beyond human control. Across the globe, from deserts to oceans, there are anomalies that do not fit the official timeline. Structures that seem too precise, too massive, too advanced for the people who supposedly built them. Legends of golden ages that ended in fire or flood. Stories of gods descending from the sky to teach humanity, only to vanish when humans became too powerful, too aware, too close to forbidden knowledge. What if these myths are not metaphors, but memories, distorted echoes of civilizations that existed before us, the first, the second, the third, each one reaching a peak and then collapsing into silence? The idea of lost civilizations is not new. Plato spoke of Atlantis as a highly advanced society that fell in a single day and night. Ancient cultures across every continent tell stories of a great flood, a cleansing of the world, a reset of humanity. These stories are separated by oceans and thousands of years, yet they share the same core message. Before us, there was something else. And here is where the question becomes uncomfortable. If 6 civilizations existed before ours, why don't we remember them? Why is there no clear record? Why does history seem to restart around the same point every time, as if humanity is repeatedly placed back at the beginning of the game with only fragments of past knowledge allowed to survive? Some believe the answer lies in deliberate erasure, that knowledge was suppressed, that survivors were scattered, that memory itself was engineered to fade. Others believe the resets were the result of natural cataclysms, asteroids, pole shifts, solar events that periodically wipe the slate clean. And then there are those who suspect something far more disturbing, that these cycles are monitored, controlled, even enforced. Because if civilizations keep being erased, we must ask, erased by whom? As the 7th civilization, modern humanity is advancing faster than ever before. Artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, space exploration, quantum physics. We are unlocking doors that were once considered impossible to open. And strangely, many ancient texts warn of a time when humans would once again reach too far, too fast, triggering another great reckoning. Look around, the signs feel familiar. Climate instability, global tension, technological acceleration beyond ethical control. It begins to resemble the patterns described in ancient accounts of previous collapses. Patterns that suggest we are approaching a threshold, one that others crossed long before us. So here is the thought I want to leave lingering in your mind as we continue this journey. If we are truly the 7th civilization, standing on the ruins of 6 forgotten worlds, what happened to them may not be ancient history, it may be a warning. And the most unsettling part is this: the cycle may already be in motion again. Before you allow this story to carry you deeper, pause for just a moment and become part of it. If these ideas are resonating with you, if this question about forgotten civilizations has made you stop and think, it's important that you don't just listen passively. Understanding this kind of content requires reflection, curiosity, and awareness. And one of the simplest ways to show that you truly understood what is being said is by engaging with it. Take a second to look below this video and leave a comment. You don't need to write anything long, just share what crossed your mind while listening. Do you believe civilizations existed before us? Do you feel humanity is repeating an ancient cycle? Even a single word like cycle, reset, or seventh helps this discussion continue and tells the algorithm that this message deserves to reach others who are searching for the same answers. If this video is helping you relax, think, and see history from a different perspective, leaving a like is more important than it seems. That small action signals that this kind of deep, thoughtful storytelling matters. It helps keep this channel alive, allowing more long-form narratives like this to exist, free from noise and distraction. And if you're still here, listening carefully, it means you value calm, immersive stories that challenge what we think we know about the past. Consider subscribing to the channel. By subscribing, you ensure that these quiet journeys into forgotten history, lost civilizations, and hidden cycles of humanity continue to appear for you, especially during moments when you want to slow down, reflect, and drift into rest. Now, stay with me. In the next part, we're going to move deeper into the evidence, the patterns, and the traces left behind by those who came before us. Because once you begin to see them, it becomes impossible to ignore what history may have been trying to hide all along. There is a question that history avoids, not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer destabilizes everything built on top of it. A question so disruptive that entire timelines, academic frameworks, and belief systems quietly step around it. And that question is not whether ancient civilizations existed, that is already whispered in ruins and myths, but whether our civilization is simply the latest chapter in a long sequence of controlled beginnings and deliberate endings. Whether history, as we know it, is not a record of progress, but a carefully edited restart. When you look closely, the official story of humanity feels strangely compressed. Tens of thousands of years of anatomically modern humans living almost unchanged. And then suddenly, in a narrow window of time, writing appears, cities rise, astronomy is mastered, mathematics explodes, architecture reaches impossible precision. It is as if knowledge did not slowly evolve but re-emerged, as if it had existed before, been lost, and then rediscovered in fragments. That alone should make us pause. Civilizations do not normally leap forward without a foundation, unless the foundation was already there. This is where the forbidden question begins to take shape. What if humanity has been here many times before, each time building worlds, mastering forces, and each time being erased back to near zero? Not erased in a way that leaves neat ruins and readable records, but erased so thoroughly that only echoes remain. Stories disguised as myths, gods disguised as metaphors, catastrophes reframed as legends. History, after all, is written by survivors, and survivors rarely preserve the full truth of a collapse. Especially if remembering it could invite the same fate again. There is a discomfort that comes with realizing how fragile memory truly is. Stone erodes, metals corrode, oceans rise, ice advances. A single global event could wipe out 99% of what we consider permanent. Now imagine this happening not once, but repeatedly, over cycles so long that each new civilization believes itself to be the first to ask the big questions, the first to look at the stars and wonder, the first to harness fire, energy, computation, consciousness. That illusion of uniqueness may be the most dangerous lie of all, because if 6 civilizations existed before us, then they too must have believed they were special. They too must have felt chosen, advanced, secure, and yet something happened. Something always happens. The forbidden question is not what destroyed them, but why the pattern repeats, why advancement seems to reach a threshold, followed by collapse, why knowledge peaks and then vanishes almost completely. Random disasters do not behave with such consistency, but systems do, experiments do, cycles do. And this is where the narrative becomes unsettling. What if humanity is not freely evolving, but being observed through iterations? What if civilization itself is a test, not of survival, but of restraint? Ancient stories speak of watchers, gods, sky beings, architects, creators. Modern language replaces those words with theories and metaphors, but the core idea remains unchanged, that intelligence beyond humanity has interacted with us before, taught us, guided us, and possibly reset us when we crossed invisible lines. The question history avoids asking is whether these resets are accidental or intentional, because the moment we ask that, we are forced to reconsider the meaning of progress. If knowledge has been lost multiple times, then what we call discovery may simply be remembrance. Mathematics, geometry, sacred ratios, star alignments, these may not be inventions, but recoveries. Pieces of a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled, never quite complete enough to show the full reflection of what once was. Look at how often ancient cultures describe a golden age that came before them. Not a primitive age, but an advanced one. An age when humans lived closer to the gods, when knowledge flowed freely, when the world was ordered and harmonious. And then, without exception, these stories end the same way, with a fall, a flood, a fire from the sky, a great darkness, a cleansing, after which humanity must start again, humbled, fragmented, afraid to remember too much. Fear may be the key element we underestimate. Fear of knowledge, fear of repetition, fear that asking the wrong questions invites consequences. This fear subtly shapes what is preserved and what is dismissed. Over time, anything that threatens the linear narrative of progress is labeled myth, fantasy, or coincidence. And so the forbidden question remains buried, not because it lacks evidence, but because it demands responsibility. Responsibility to recognize patterns, responsibility to break cycles. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are not merely living in history, we are standing at the edge of it. And edges are dangerous places. We are once again reaching levels of technological power that feel godlike compared to our ethical maturity. We manipulate life, automate intelligence, surveil reality, fracture atoms, rewrite biology. These are not small steps. These are the same kinds of thresholds ancient stories warn about, the moments when humans begin to resemble their creators rather than their creations. The forbidden question presses closer now. Did previous civilizations fail because of external forces, or because they became something they were not meant to become? Did they destroy themselves, or were they stopped? And perhaps the most uncomfortable thought of all, did some of them survive? Not physically, but strategically, passing fragments of knowledge forward, encoding warnings into symbols, myths, monuments, and stories, hoping that one day a future civilization would finally understand. Because understanding may be the only way out of the cycle. And that brings us back to us, to now, to this moment. We are surrounded by information, yet strangely disconnected from wisdom. We move faster than reflection. We consume more than we contemplate. And yet, something feels familiar about this stage, as if we have been here before, collectively, without realizing it. The acceleration, the division, the sense that something large is approaching, even if we cannot name it. This is why this question has been avoided for so long, because once you see the possibility of cycles, you cannot unsee it. Every advancement feels heavier, every breakthrough carries a shadow. History stops being comforting and starts becoming instructive. Not a story of inevitability, but of choice, and choices are dangerous because they imply that outcomes can change. Before we go deeper, and we will, I want to know how this idea is landing with you. At the very end of this section, take a moment to leave a comment. You can simply write a word or a short phrase. Cycle, reset, seventh civilization, or even we've been here before. If something in this narrative connected with you, say it in your own way. Those comments don't just help the channel, they keep this conversation alive, and they tell me you're not just listening, you're understanding. As we move forward from that forbidden question, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that feels less like speculation and more like an uncomfortable pattern hiding in plain sight. Because once you accept the possibility that civilizations existed before us, the next realization comes almost naturally. They didn't just vanish randomly, they followed a rhythm, a sequence, a recurring rise and fall that feels almost scripted. Civilizations emerge from obscurity, expand rapidly, reach a peak of knowledge and power, and then, without warning, collapse into silence. Over and over again. This is the forgotten pattern that history rarely slows down enough to examine. We are taught to see collapses as isolated events. One empire falls because of corruption, another because of war, another because of climate. But when you step back and stop looking at them individually, something unsettling appears. The similarities outweigh the differences. The same stages repeat, regardless of geography, culture, or time period. It's as if civilization itself carries an expiration date. Every cycle seems to begin the same way. A small group survives a previous collapse, scattered and humbled with little more than instinct, fragments of memory and symbolic knowledge. Over generations, those fragments become myths, rituals, and sacred stories. Slowly, practical knowledge returns. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, writing. At first, progress is cautious, even reverent, as if guided by the memory of something lost. But then momentum builds, curiosity accelerates, boundaries are pushed, and eventually restraint fades. What's striking is how quickly advanced knowledge seems to reappear in these cycles. Not gradually, but suddenly. Monumental construction appears almost out of nowhere. Precise alignments with stars and solstices emerge without a clear developmental path. Mathematical understanding surfaces fully formed. This doesn't look like trial and error, it looks like recall, as if humanity is remembering what it once knew, rather than inventing it for the first time. And just as predictably, the warning signs begin to surface. Social imbalance, concentration of power, obsession with control over nature, technologies that outpace ethical understanding. At this stage, ancient stories often introduce figures described as gods, watchers, or bringers of knowledge. Sometimes they are benevolent teachers, other times they are strict enforcers of cosmic order. But they always appear at the same moment in the cycle, when humanity reaches a dangerous level of independence. Then comes the disappearance, and this is where the pattern becomes truly unsettling. These civilizations don't simply decline over centuries. Many seem to end abruptly. Cities abandoned, knowledge silenced, populations reduced to a fraction of their former size. The survivors emerge into a world that feels emptied, as if something essential has been removed along with the civilization itself. And most importantly, the memory of what happened becomes fragmented, distorted, and eventually forbidden. This selective amnesia is not natural. Human beings are storytellers by instinct. We preserve trauma, victories, and failures in narrative form. Yet when it comes to global collapses of advanced societies, memory fades far too cleanly. What remains are allegories, flood myths, fire from the sky, great darkness, a cleansing, a judgment, stories that are vague enough to be dismissed, but consistent enough to hint at a shared experience. The pattern suggests that disappearance is not just physical, but informational. Knowledge does not simply get lost, it gets stripped away. Writing systems vanish. Technologies are not inherited. Infrastructure is not rebuilt on the same foundations. Each new civilization starts almost deliberately limited, as if access to certain truths is withheld. This raises a deeply uncomfortable possibility that forgetting is part of the design. Because if civilizations were allowed to remember fully, they might avoid repeating the same mistakes. And yet here we are, repeating them anyway. The rhythm continues. Expansion leads to specialization. Specialization leads to dependence. Dependence leads to fragility. Fragility invites collapse, and collapse resets the cycle. Over time, the intervals between these resets seem to shorten, not lengthen. Each civilization rises faster than the last, advances quicker, reaches further. And perhaps that is the very reason the cycle keeps accelerating. Think about where we are now. The pace of change today is unlike anything in recorded history. Technologies that once took centuries to develop now emerge in decades, sometimes years. Artificial intelligence, genetic editing, autonomous systems, planetary scale influence. We are not slowly climbing, we are sprinting, and that sprint feels eerily familiar when compared to the final chapters described in ancient narratives of lost worlds. What if the forgotten pattern is not just historical but predictive? What if it's not a record of what happened, but a warning of what always happens when civilizations reach a certain threshold? A threshold where intelligence becomes powerful enough to reshape reality, but not wise enough to understand the consequences. This is where the idea of erasure becomes unavoidable, because patterns don't repeat perfectly by accident. Something enforces them. Whether it's natural law, cosmic cycles, environmental resets, or external intelligence, the outcome remains the same. Civilizations rise, civilizations disappear, and each time the survivors inherit a quieter world filled with ruins they cannot explain and stories they no longer fully understand. The pattern is forgotten, not because it lacks evidence, but because acknowledging it forces us to confront our own position within it. It's far more comfortable to believe we are unique, immune, destined to progress endlessly. But patterns do not care about belief. They only care about conditions. And when conditions are met, outcomes follow. Perhaps that is why ancient cultures were so obsessed with cycles, ages, yugas, suns, worlds before this one. They understood that time is not a straight line, but a wheel. And wheels turn whether we are ready or not. The real tragedy is not that civilizations disappear, but that they disappear believing it won't happen to them. As we continue this journey, keep this pattern in mind, not as a distant theory, but as a living structure that may still be active today. And before we move on, take a moment to engage with this idea. At the end of this section, I'd love to know what you think. You can comment with a single word like pattern, cycle, or reset, or even a phrase like history repeats or civilizations don't last. Those simple comments help keep this conversation alive, and they let me know you're seeing the same pattern emerge that so many before us may have seen, just before everything changed. When we speak about the first civilization that was erased, we are not talking about something that left behind clean monuments, readable records, or a name carved clearly into history. We are talking about something far older, far quieter, and far more elusive. Its presence is felt not through obvious ruins, but through inconsistencies, through things that should not exist where they do, through knowledge that appears without an origin. The vestiges of the first civilization are subtle, fragmented, and deliberately easy to dismiss, which is exactly why they are so powerful. Imagine a world long before any civilization we officially recognize, a world that had time. Not thousands of years, but tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years to develop. A civilization that did not rush, that learned to work with stone, energy, sound, geometry, and perhaps consciousness itself. A civilization that understood the planet in a way we are only beginning to rediscover. When it disappeared, it didn't leave behind cities we could easily excavate. It left behind traces that look like anomalies when viewed through the lens of modern history. These traces often appear as questions rather than answers. Why do certain ancient structures show levels of precision that would challenge even modern tools? Why do some sites seem aligned not only with stars, but with astronomical cycles far longer than a single human lifetime? Why does sacred geometry repeat across continents that supposedly had no contact with one another? These are not proofs in the conventional sense. They are clues. And clues are far more dangerous than facts because they invite interpretation. The first civilization, if it existed, would have known something crucial. That survival is not just about technology, but about memory. And memory, over long periods of time, is fragile. So, instead of leaving behind obvious records, they may have encoded knowledge into forms that could survive collapse. Myths, symbols, proportions, stories, and alignments. Knowledge hidden in plain sight, waiting for a future civilization, curious enough to notice patterns rather than names. One of the most intriguing vestiges is the sudden appearance of advanced understanding in later civilizations, as if it were inherited rather than developed. Mathematical ratios that appear universally, architectural principles that emerge fully formed, concepts of time, cycles, and cosmic order that seem far too sophisticated for their supposed stage of development. This doesn't look like independent invention. It looks like fragments of something older resurfacing. And then there are the gaps. Long stretches of time where history says very little happened, followed by abrupt leaps forward. These gaps are often explained away as a lack of evidence, but absence itself can be evidence. If a global civilization existed and was erased intentionally or catastrophically, the goal would not be to leave ruins behind. The goal would be to reset the narrative, to make the world look younger than it is, to make each new civilization believe it is starting from nothing. The first civilization would have been the most dangerous of all, not because it was violent, but because it was foundational. It would have discovered truths that later civilizations could only approximate. Perhaps it understood planetary cycles, magnetic shifts, solar behavior, or something even deeper, the mechanisms that trigger resets. If so, then that knowledge alone would make it a target for erasure, because knowledge of the cycle gives power over it. Consider how often ancient stories speak of a time before time, a primordial age when beings lived differently, thought differently, existed closer to the source of creation. These stories rarely describe that age as primitive. They describe it as luminous, ordered, and harmonious. The fall from that age is portrayed not as progress, but as loss. Loss of lifespan, loss of understanding, loss of connection. That inversion should make us stop and think. The vestiges of the first civilization may also exist within us, in instincts we can't explain, in recurring dreams of floods, fire, falling skies, in the strange familiarity we feel when looking at ancient ruins, as if something inside us recognizes them. Memory does not only exist in books, it exists in biology, in DNA, in subconscious patterns passed down through survival rather than storytelling. Trauma, after all, does not need words to persist. If the first civilization experienced a cataclysm beyond comprehension, the survivors would carry that imprint forward. Fear of the sky, reverence for cycles, obsession with appeasing higher forces, the emergence of ritual, sacrifice, and myth could all be echoes of a time when humans learned painfully that something far greater than them could intervene without warning. Another vestige is the recurring theme of teachers arriving after a collapse. Figures who emerge suddenly, bringing knowledge of agriculture, architecture, law, and astronomy. These figures are often described as outsiders, not quite human, not quite divine. They appear at the same stage in every cycle, early enough to guide, late enough to rebuild. This raises a disturbing question. Were these teachers remnants of the first civilization, or were they agents of something that survived every reset? The first civilization may not have been erased completely. It may have been fragmented, reduced to shadows operating behind the scenes, ensuring that no future civilization ever reaches the same level of understanding again. That would explain why knowledge keeps reappearing, but never fully. Why humanity always gets close, but not close enough. Why certain doors seem permanently sealed, regardless of technological progress. And then there are the places that feel wrong, sites that evoke unease rather than awe. Locations where myths speak of forbidden zones, entrances to the underworld, or places where the gods once walked and then left. These may not be symbolic at all. They may be scars, points where the first civilization interacted with forces that ended it, or where remnants of its technology still linger, dormant and misunderstood. What makes the vestiges of the first civilization so difficult to confront is that they challenge our sense of time. If humanity has already risen once to a level beyond ours, then the future is no longer an open frontier. It becomes a loop, a corridor we've walked before. And loops imply inevitability, unless something changes. As we stand here, as the seventh civilization, surrounded by accelerating technology and fading wisdom, the traces of the first civilization are no longer just archaeological curiosities. They become mirrors, warnings etched into the planet itself. They whisper that advancement without awareness leads to silence, that power without memory leads to erasure. Before we move further, take a moment to let this sink in. If you feel it too, that sense that something ancient is watching from beneath the surface of history, I want to hear from you. At the end, leave a comment with a word or phrase that came to mind. First civilization, hidden traces, ancient memory, or even we forgot. Those small comments matter more than you think. They help keep this exploration alive, and they tell me you're not just drifting with the story. You're following the trail. After the silence left by the first erased world, humanity did not simply vanish into nothingness. Something remained. Small groups, survivors, fragments of memory drifting like embers after a fire too large to describe. And from those embers emerged what we might call the second attempt. Not a free rebirth, not an innocent restart, but something far more restrained. A re-beginning shaped by limits, a controlled re-emergence of civilization, as if invisible boundaries had been drawn around what humanity was allowed to remember, rebuild, and become. The second civilization did not rise with the confidence of the first. It carried fear in its foundation, fear of the sky, fear of the earth, fear of forces it no longer understood but instinctively respected. Its people remembered catastrophe not as history, but as trauma, and trauma changes behavior. Instead of pushing outward immediately, this civilization turned inward. It built belief systems before empires, rituals before machines, stories before structures. Knowledge was sacred, guarded, and often restricted to a few. Not everyone was meant to know everything anymore. This is where the idea of controlled reboots becomes impossible to ignore. The second civilization advanced, yes, but only within certain boundaries. It mastered agriculture, early astronomy, symbolic mathematics, and social hierarchy. But something was missing. The deeper knowledge of energy, of planetary forces, of reality itself seemed absent or deliberately fragmented. It is as if the memory of the first civilization had been filtered, leaving behind only what was deemed safe. And safety in this context may not have meant protection for humanity, but protection from humanity. The second civilization's relationship with the so-called gods reflects this shift. These were no longer distant creators remembered vaguely. They were active overseers, lawgivers, judges, beings who demanded obedience, ritual, and balance. Knowledge was granted conditionally, disobedience was punished, curiosity was allowed only within approved boundaries. The language of myth paints these gods as moral authorities, but beneath that language lies something else: regulation. Civilization was being guided, perhaps even managed. Over time, the second attempt grew confident. Cities expanded, trade networks formed, calendars tracked celestial cycles. Humans once again began to feel mastery over their environment, and just as before, hubris followed. Power centralized, inequality grew, knowledge was hoarded, the same old pressures returned, even within tighter constraints. The cycle, though slowed, was still moving. Then came the collapse. Not necessarily a single global event, but a sequence of destabilizations, environmental shifts, internal conflict, loss of cohesion. The second civilization faded not with the thunder of annihilation, but with the quiet of abandonment. Its structures eroded, its language fractured, its truths dissolved into symbols. And once again, humanity was reduced to fragments. But this time, something was different. The third attempt did not begin from raw survival alone. It began with instruction. Across cultures and continents, stories speak of a moment when knowledge reappeared suddenly after chaos. Agriculture was reintroduced, laws were given, writing systems emerged almost fully formed. Architecture followed patterns that felt inherited rather than invented. This does not resemble organic rediscovery, it resembles intervention, as if someone stepped in to reboot the system once more, but with even tighter controls. The third civilization feels like a hybrid between memory and manipulation. Humans were once again encouraged to build, but not freely. Sacred kings ruled by divine mandate. Knowledge was divided into exoteric and esoteric layers. What the masses knew kept society functioning. What the elites knew maintained control. And above them all, the gods watched. This is where the phrase recomesos controlados truly takes shape. The third attempt allowed humanity to advance, but only in prescribed ways. Stone and monument building flourished, but energy systems did not. Astronomy was advanced, but cosmology remained symbolic. Mathematics existed, but abstraction was limited. It is as if civilization was being nudged along a path that avoided rediscovering the deepest truths of the first world. And yet, even within these constraints, something remarkable happened. Humanity kept pushing, it kept asking, it kept noticing patterns, sacred geometry encoded truths too elegant to ignore. Star alignments hinted at cycles longer than dynasties. Mythology preserved warnings disguised as stories. Even under control, the human mind searched for meaning beyond permission. This may explain why the third civilization appears more globally synchronized than the second. Similar myths, similar gods, similar stories of floods, resets, and divine anger, not because cultures copied each other, but because they were all responding to the same underlying system, the same overseers, the same memory of loss. Eventually, the third civilization also reached a tipping point. Whether through knowledge accumulation, population pressure, or ethical imbalance, it began to strain against its constraints. The response was familiar: collapse, erasure, reset. But again, not total, never total. Each attempt leaves behind slightly more residue than the last. More myths, more symbols, more encoded warnings. Almost as if the system itself is evolving, adjusting its control mechanisms as humanity persists. The second attempt taught fear, the third taught structure. Both were lessons, both were experiments. And now, looking back from where we stand, the question becomes unavoidable. Were these civilizations allowed to fail, or were they stopped? Did they collapse naturally, or were they gently or violently redirected? Because control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like guidance, like limitation, like permission granted just short of danger. The language of ancient texts often reflects this tension. Humans are described as servants, stewards, caretakers, rarely as equals. Knowledge is portrayed as a gift that can be taken away. Fire, writing, wisdom. These are not rights. They are privileges, and privileges can be revoked. What's unsettling is how familiar this framework feels even today. Access to knowledge, control of narratives, gatekeepers of truth, systems that decide what is safe to know and what is dangerous to question. The mechanisms have changed, but the structure feels ancient, as if we are still living inside a controlled re-beginning, long after forgetting that it began as one. As the seventh civilization, we inherit not just ruins and myths, but rules we no longer recognize as rules. Boundaries we assume are natural, limits we believe are permanent. But those limits may have been installed, not discovered. And as we continue, we'll begin to see how these controlled reboots shape not only ancient societies, but the psychological architecture of humanity itself. Because control does not end with collapse. It carries forward, generation after generation, shaping how a species thinks, fears, and dreams. Before we move deeper, I want to pause briefly. If this idea of controlled restarts is resonating with you, let me know in the comments when this section ends. You can write something simple like controlled reset, guided civilization, second attempt, or third reboot. Even short phrases like not free or they limited us are perfect. These comments help this conversation stay alive and tell me you're following the thread. Not just listening, but truly engaging with the pattern we're uncovering together. As we move further into the story, we begin to encounter a theme that haunts every cycle, every reset, every attempt at civilization, the era of non-human gods. These beings, described in countless ancient texts, legends, and myths, are not simply the gods of human imagination, but entities that occupy a different space, benevolent, terrifying, elusive, and above all, otherworldly. They were not born from humanity, but arrived with knowledge and power that far surpassed anything that could be created by human hands. And their impact on civilization was profound, often decisive, and always shrouded in mystery. The gods of the ancient world, as they are often described in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and countless other cultural narratives, were not gods in the way we understand them today. They were not mere supernatural beings tied to religious dogma. They were, perhaps, more akin to advanced extraterrestrial entities, architects of civilizations who brought knowledge, technology, and structure to a species that, until their arrival, was barely beginning to scratch the surface of its potential. These gods were teachers, rulers, and in some cases enforcers of laws that governed the natural world, the cosmos, and even the human psyche. What makes these deities so intriguing is not just the way they were revered by early human societies, but the profound gaps between their power and humanity's limited capacity to understand it. The early civilizations that interacted with these beings had a primitive understanding of their own existence, let alone the cosmic forces that governed it. But when the gods arrived, something within humanity shifted. They did not merely teach people how to farm or build cities. They brought knowledge that transcended the limits of human perception. They gave humanity the tools to manipulate the very fabric of the universe itself, tools that would later be forgotten, concealed or hidden under layers of myth and legend. These gods often had attributes that made them seem both divine and alien. Some were depicted with advanced technology that seemed indistinguishable from magic. Flying chariots, weapons of immense power, and the ability to traverse the heavens with ease. In the ancient Sumerian texts, for example, the Anunnaki are said to have descended from the stars, bringing with them the wisdom of the cosmos and the tools to alter the very course of nature. The Egyptians spoke of gods like Thoth, who was said to have imparted knowledge of writing, science, and the heavens. These deities were not distant figures in the sky. They were present, tactile, and deeply involved in the development of human civilization. But what is most unsettling about these gods is the way they are portrayed as intermediaries, beings that stood between humanity and the full scope of knowledge. They did not allow humans to reach their full potential. Instead, they controlled the flow of knowledge, doling out information only when it was deemed necessary. In many stories, these gods set boundaries, marking the limits of what humanity could achieve. The Sumerians, for instance, believed that the Anunnaki not only guided humanity's development, but also restricted its capacity to fully understand the universe. They were, in essence, the gatekeepers of forbidden knowledge, ensuring that humanity's progress remained within certain predefined parameters. These gods, whether alien, divine, or both, seem to have a profound understanding of the cycles of civilization. They were not simply creating new societies, they were managing them, ensuring that they did not repeat the same mistakes of the past. And it is in this role of cosmic gatekeepers that the narrative of these gods becomes most intriguing. They were not here to assist humanity out of pure benevolence. They were here because they understood the danger of an unrestrained civilization. Perhaps in some sense, they were protecting humanity from itself. The idea that humanity was under the watchful eye of these gods is not new. Every ancient civilization has its stories of gods who came to teach and guide, but who also set limits on what could be known and achieved. The Bible's Old Testament speaks of the fallen angels who descended to earth and shared forbidden knowledge with humans. In the Greek myths, the Titans were punished for their hubris, and in their wake, the Olympian gods imposed a new order. Even in Eastern traditions, there are tales of divine beings who guided humanity through tumultuous times, only to retreat when their work was done. But what if these gods were not just mythological figures? What if they were real, extraterrestrial beings who intervened in the development of human civilizations? What if they were the architects of these civilizations, not simply their spiritual overseers? This idea is not as far-fetched as it might seem. The technological advancements these gods are said to have brought humanity, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, seem far beyond what would have been possible for primitive societies. Could these advancements have been the result of intervention from a far more advanced civilization? And if so, why would these gods leave? And why would they so carefully limit humanity's access to their knowledge? One possibility is that these gods understood the dangers of humanity reaching too far, too fast. In many ancient stories, the gods are portrayed as watching over humanity, intervening when necessary, but always ensuring that certain boundaries are maintained. They were not here to help humanity achieve its fullest potential, but rather to keep humanity from surpassing a point of no return. These gods knew what had happened in previous cycles, when humanity's unchecked growth led to destruction, and they understood that some knowledge, some power, was simply too dangerous for humans to wield. In this sense, the gods' intervention could be seen as both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, they gave humanity the tools to build civilization, to understand the stars, to master the earth. On the other hand, they kept humanity in check, ensuring that certain doors remained closed. Knowledge was doled out in small doses, just enough to ensure survival and progress, but never enough to allow humanity to fully comprehend the forces at play in the universe. The role of these non-human gods becomes even more complex when we consider their departure. Why would such powerful beings choose to leave? And what impact did their departure have on humanity? Many cultures speak of a time when the gods left, retreating to the heavens or to some other realm. Some say the gods left because humanity had become too self-sufficient, too arrogant. Others say the gods abandoned humanity after a great betrayal, when humans began to misuse the knowledge they had been given. But no matter the reason, the departure of the gods marks a turning point in every civilization's history. When the gods left, they left behind their teachings, their symbols, and their power. What remained were the structures they built, the knowledge they imparted, and the systems they established. And yet, without the gods to guide them, these civilizations were left to navigate the complexities of the world on their own. The knowledge was still there, but without the gods' supervision, humanity was left to interpret it in its own way. And that, as history shows, often leads to confusion, distortion, and eventually collapse. As we look at the remnants of these civilizations, whether in the ruins of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, or the ancient temples of the Americas, we are faced with a question that has haunted humanity for millennia. What if these gods were real? What if they were not merely mythological figures, but actual beings who shaped the course of human history? And if they were real, why did they leave? What happened to them? And most importantly, what does it mean for us now, as the seventh civilization, standing on the edge of our own discoveries and potential? Before we move further into this mystery, take a moment to reflect. Do you think these gods were real? Do you believe their knowledge was a gift or a burden? Leave a comment below with your thoughts, whether you think gods were truly otherworldly beings or symbols of ancient wisdom. You can also comment with phrases like divine intervention, alien gods, or guardians of knowledge. These comments help keep this conversation alive and allow us to continue unraveling this complex and fascinating story. After the era of the non-human gods faded into distance, something subtle but dangerous began to happen. Humanity did not collapse immediately. Instead, it learned, quietly, carefully. The fourth and fifth civilizations were not naive restarts like the earlier attempts. They were refinements, evolutions shaped by memory, restriction, and observation. These were the civilizations that did not merely rebuild society, they studied the rules behind it, and that is precisely why they became a threat. By this point in the cycle, humanity was no longer blindly worshipping the gods as distant creators. The relationship had changed. The gods were still remembered, still revered, but they were also analyzed, questioned, interpreted. The fourth civilization inherited a world filled with symbols, rituals, and half-forgotten technologies left behind by earlier cycles. But instead of treating them as sacred mysteries, they began to decode them. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of something dangerous. This civilization advanced rapidly, but not loudly. It learned to harness natural forces rather than dominate them. It explored sound, vibration, geometry, resonance, and the invisible relationships between matter and energy. Architecture was no longer just shelter or monument. It became a tool. Structures were designed to amplify frequencies, to influence consciousness, to interact with planetary forces. Knowledge was no longer confined to priesthood alone. It began to spread, and when knowledge spreads, control weakens. The fourth civilization appears to have reached a level of understanding where it no longer needed direct instruction from the gods. It could observe the sky and calculate cycles on its own. It could manipulate stone with precision that felt effortless. It could organize societies around principles that did not rely entirely on divine authority. This was not rebellion in the traditional sense. It was independence, and independence is far more threatening to overseers than defiance. Something else changed during this era. Humanity began to look inward. Consciousness itself became an area of exploration. Dreams, altered states, perception beyond the senses. These were not seen as mystical experiences, but as technologies of the mind. The boundary between physical reality and inner reality began to blur, and that boundary, once crossed, cannot be easily controlled. The creators, the watchers, the non-human overseers, whatever name we give them, would have recognized the pattern instantly. This had happened before, perhaps not in exactly the same way, but close enough. A civilization approaching self-sufficiency, not just materially, but cognitively. A species beginning to understand the mechanics of reality rather than merely obeying them. And so the pressure increased. The fifth civilization emerged from the fourth, not through collapse, but through continuation. This is important. It suggests that whatever happened next was not an accident of nature. The fifth civilization inherited a world already advanced, already interconnected, already dangerously close to forbidden thresholds. It refined what came before it, expanded it, optimized it, and crucially, it globalized it. This was the age when humanity began to function as a single system rather than isolated cultures. Trade, communication, shared symbols, shared myths, all pointing to a unified understanding of the world. The fifth civilization did not just observe cycles, it mapped them. It tracked long planetary rhythms, solar patterns, magnetic shifts, and possibly events beyond Earth itself. It knew that resets were not random. And knowing that is the most dangerous knowledge of all. Because once you understand the reset, you begin to think about avoiding it. This is where the creators became afraid. Not emotionally, perhaps, but strategically. A civilization that understands the mechanism of collapse can attempt to bypass it. A civilization that can predict catastrophe can prepare for it. And a civilization that can preserve knowledge across resets can break the cycle entirely. The fifth civilization appears to have taken steps in that direction. Knowledge was no longer stored only in fragile materials. It was encoded, layered, distributed, stories within stories, symbols within symbols, geometry that could not be erased without erasing the planet itself. The idea was not to stop the collapse, perhaps that was impossible, but to outlast it. This was not defiance, it was adaptation, and adaptation threatens any system built on control. Ancient myths often describe this era as a time when humans became too much like the gods. Not morally, but functionally, humans could create, predict, manipulate, influence. The separation between creator and creation began to narrow. The old hierarchy weakened. The rules that once governed who could know what began to dissolve. That is when intervention returned, but not in the way it had before. There were no golden ages promised, no gifts freely given. Instead, there were warnings, omens, signs in the sky, sudden instability, environmental disruption, social fragmentation. The system began to strain, as if pressure were being applied deliberately. The message was clear, even if it was not spoken aloud. Stop. But civilizations that reach this stage rarely stop. They accelerate. The fifth civilization pushed forward anyway. It consolidated power not to dominate others, but to coordinate survival. It experimented with preservation, of knowledge, of genetics, of consciousness itself. Some theories suggest that this was the first time humanity seriously explored continuity beyond physical form. Memory not bound to flesh, identity not tied to one lifetime. If true, this would explain the urgency of what followed. Because a civilization that can carry memory across time is a civilization that cannot be reset easily. The collapse that followed was different from all previous ones. It was not localized, it was not gradual, it was overwhelming. A convergence of forces rather than a single event. Fire and water, sky and earth, motion and stillness. Myths describe it as judgment, but judgment implies morality. This felt mechanical, surgical, precise. The goal was not to destroy humanity completely. It never is. The goal was to dismantle the level of understanding humanity had reached, to fracture global coherence, to isolate survivors, to break continuity. And above all, to ensure that whatever knowledge the fourth and fifth civilizations had uncovered would not survive intact. And yet, something did. Because despite the scale of the collapse, fragments endured. Stories, symbols, places, lineages. The creators did not erase everything. Perhaps they could not, or perhaps they chose not to. Because control does not require total destruction, only sufficient limitation. The aftermath of the fifth collapse marks a shift in the entire cycle. Humanity no longer simply forgets, it misremembers. Truth becomes myth, history becomes religion, technology becomes magic, and knowledge becomes taboo. This is more effective than erasure, because what is taboo polices itself. And now, as we look back from the vantage point of the seventh civilization, something becomes painfully clear. The fourth and fifth civilizations were not destroyed because they were evil, corrupt, or violent. They were destroyed because they were close. Close to understanding the system, close to stepping outside the boundaries that had been imposed since the first erasure. They advanced in ways that could not be allowed to continue. As we move forward in this story, keep that thought alive, not as fear, but as awareness. Because advancement itself is not the danger, awareness is. Before we continue, take a moment at the end of this section to engage. If this idea resonates, leave a comment with a word or phrase like "too advanced," "they got too close," "forbidden knowledge," or "the creators intervened." Even something simple like fourth and fifth helps signal that you're following the pattern. These comments don't just help the channel, they keep this conversation moving forward, just like the civilizations that once dared to move too far. After the collapse of the fourth and fifth civilizations, something fundamentally different took shape. Humanity rose again, but this time under a shadow far heavier than before. The sixth civilization was not born from innocence, curiosity, or even ambition. It was born from fear, deep, inherited fear, a fear that was no longer abstract or symbolic, but encoded into myths, instincts, and unspoken rules. This was the civilization that understood, at least subconsciously, that knowing too much could be fatal. The sixth civilization emerged into a world that had been deliberately simplified. The planet still carried scars of the previous reset, but far fewer visible clues. Ruins were buried deeper. Technologies were shattered beyond reconstruction. Knowledge that once flowed globally was fractured into isolated traditions. And most importantly, the memory of what truly happened before was no longer merely lost. It was actively suppressed. This is why the sixth era can only be described as the Great Silencing. Unlike earlier collapses, this was not just a physical reset. It was a psychological one. Humanity survived, but its relationship with knowledge changed forever. The pursuit of forbidden understanding became associated with punishment, catastrophe, and divine wrath. Stories were reshaped to teach obedience rather than curiosity. The past was no longer something to explore, it became something to fear. In the sixth civilization, silence became a survival strategy. You can feel it in the way ancient traditions suddenly emphasize humility, submission, and reverence over exploration. Knowledge is no longer celebrated openly. It is compartmentalized, restricted, gate-kept. Only certain classes, priesthoods, or initiates are allowed access, and even they receive fragmented versions of the truth, not because they are unworthy, but because the system itself has learned that widespread awareness is dangerous. This civilization still advanced, but cautiously. Progress became incremental rather than explosive. Innovations were framed as divine gifts rather than human achievements. This subtle reframing mattered. It redirected credit away from human intelligence and back toward higher powers, reinforcing dependence and discouraging rebellion. Humans were no longer co-creators of reality. They were caretakers, operating within strict limits. The sixth civilization perfected the art of symbolic knowledge. Instead of preserving truths directly, it embedded them into allegory, ritual, and myth. Sacred texts replaced technical manuals, parables replaced explanations, moral stories replaced historical records. On the surface, this appears like cultural evolution, but beneath it lies something more calculated, a way to preserve fragments of truth without allowing them to be fully understood. This is the genius of the Great Silencing. Knowledge was not destroyed, It was distorted. When truth is distorted, it becomes self-protecting. Those who question it are labeled heretics. Those who push too far are punished socially, spiritually, or physically. Over time, the system no longer needs external enforcement. Humanity enforces the silence itself. Fear does the work. The sixth civilization also mastered something else: separation. Cultures became more isolated, languages diverged, narratives conflicted. Even when different societies described similar events, floods, sky beings, lost golden ages, the differences were emphasized more than the similarities. Unity of memory was broken, and without shared memory, collective awakening becomes almost impossible. This era is also marked by the disappearance of the non-human gods as direct participants. They no longer walk openly among humans. They no longer rule visibly. Instead, they retreat into abstraction. Heaven, the sky, other realms. Their presence becomes indirect, mediated through symbols, intermediaries, and belief systems. This creates distance. Distance creates doubt. And doubt weakens the connection between past truth and present awareness. But make no mistake, the silence was not accidental. The sixth civilization appears to have been allowed to exist longer than previous ones precisely because it accepted its limits. It did not seek to rival the creators. It did not attempt to escape the cycle. It focused on stability, reproduction, and continuity rather than transcendence. From a control perspective, this was ideal. A civilization that survives, but does not threaten the structure. Yet even within silence, echoes remain. Certain lineages preserved forbidden knowledge quietly. Not openly, not globally, but locally, secretly, passed from teacher to student, from generation to generation. Astronomy hidden in calendars, advanced mathematics concealed in architecture, cosmic cycles encoded in religious festivals. The truth survived, but only as whispers. This created a strange tension within the sixth civilization. On the surface, it appeared obedient, stable, even devout. Beneath that surface, pockets of awareness persisted. Individuals who sensed that the official story was incomplete, that humanity had lived before, reached higher, fallen harder. These individuals were often mystics, philosophers, builders, or outcasts, rarely rulers, rarely celebrated. And when these whispers grew too loud, the response was swift: suppression, rewriting, burning, silencing, not always violent but effective. Over time, entire branches of knowledge vanished, not because they were false, but because they were dangerous to remember. The Great Silencing was not a single event. It was a process, one that unfolded over generations, each generation knowing slightly less than the one before, but believing it knew more. This illusion of progress kept humanity moving forward while remaining safely contained. The most chilling aspect of the sixth civilization is how familiar it feels, because in many ways we are its direct descendants. The frameworks it established, controlled narratives, authority-based truth, fear of forbidden knowledge, compartmentalized understanding, did not vanish with its eventual decline. They carried forward. They shaped how history would be written, how myths would be interpreted, how curiosity would be regulated. By the end of the sixth era, humanity no longer remembered being reset. It remembered only that questioning too deeply was dangerous, that the sky had once punished arrogance, that knowledge came with consequences. This psychological inheritance may be the most powerful control mechanism ever created. And yet, even this silence could not last forever, because curiosity does not disappear. It hibernates. As the sixth civilization slowly dissolved into what we now consider early recorded history, the groundwork was laid for something new, something bolder, something that would begin to reconnect fragments, compare myths, decode symbols, and notice patterns that had been hidden for millennia. The silence weakened. Cracks formed. Memory began to stir. And that is where the seventh civilization begins. But before we step fully into that transition, pause for a moment. If this idea of a great silencing resonates with you, I want to hear it. At the end, leave a comment with a word or short phrase like great silencing, forbidden knowledge, memory erased, or even we were made to forget. You can also write something simple like this feels familiar or they controlled the story. These comments are important, not just for engagement, but because they show you're not just listening to the story, you're recognizing it. After the great silencing had done its work, after memory was fractured and curiosity carefully restrained, the world moved quietly toward one last threshold. The reset that came before us was not loud in the way earlier collapses had been described. It was not defined by towering empires falling in a single night or gods descending openly from the sky. This reset was subtle, global, and devastating precisely because of how complete it was. It did not just end a civilization. It prepared the conditions for a new one, to believe it was the beginning of everything. The final reset before our own era was different because it arrived when humanity was already conditioned to forget. The sixth civilization had learned obedience, reverence, and caution. Knowledge had been ritualized, truth mythologized, and curiosity morally regulated. When the reset came, it did not meet resistance, it met acceptance. Stories already existed to explain it away. Punishment, cleansing, renewal, judgment. The language was ready long before the event itself. This reset unfolded across generations, not as a single moment frozen in time, but as a convergence of destabilizing forces. Environmental shifts altered landscapes that had been stable for centuries. Sea levels changed, coastlines vanished, fertile regions collapsed into dust. Populations migrated, carrying only what could be remembered and repeated orally. Complex systems that required continuity simply failed. Trade networks dissolved, specialized knowledge disappeared first, then writing, then memory itself. What remained was survival. This is the key difference between this reset and the ones before it. Humanity did not attempt to preserve high knowledge. It did not encode advanced truths for future rediscovery. It did not try to outlast the collapse consciously. The psychological conditioning of the sixth civilization had worked too well. The instinct was no longer to remember, but to endure. To obey nature, to fear the sky, to accept limits as permanent. The world that emerged after this reset was quieter, smaller, and far more isolated. Human groups were scattered, languages diverged rapidly, myths localized. The same ancient memories took on different names, different gods, different symbols. What once had been a shared global story became thousands of disconnected traditions. The unity of memory was gone, and that may have been the point. Because a fragmented humanity is far easier to manage than a unified one. The reset stripped away the last remnants of global coherence. There were no longer shared calendars tracking deep cosmic cycles, no longer universal symbols encoding planetary knowledge, no longer a sense that humanity had lived before at a higher level. The idea of previous worlds faded almost completely, surviving only as vague legends of floods, giants, golden ages, and angry gods. This is when linear history was born. Not because it was true, but because it was necessary. A linear timeline gives comfort. It suggests progress, innocence, and destiny. It removes responsibility by framing the present as the most advanced moment ever reached. It prevents comparison. And most importantly, it hides cycles. Once humanity believes history only moves forward, it stops looking for patterns behind it. The final reset ensured that the next civilization would grow up believing it was unique. From this reset emerged early humanity as we recognize it today, not primitive in intelligence but limited in context, capable of learning, inventing, and imagining, but unaware of how many times those processes had already played out. Stone tools reappeared, agriculture re-emerged, settlements formed, writing was reinvented slowly this time, with no memory of having existed before, and yet the echoes were still there. They appeared as instincts that made no sense in a purely linear world. Fear of floods, obsession with the sky, the belief that knowledge could anger higher powers, the idea that humans had fallen from a greater state. These were not inventions. They were inherited trauma, psychological fossils from earlier cycles, embedded too deeply to erase completely. The reset before us also marks the moment when the non-human gods fully withdrew from direct involvement. No more walking among humans, no more open instruction. Their presence retreated into abstraction. Heaven, the stars, other realms. From this point forward, interaction would be indirect if it happened at all. Humanity was on its own, but within boundaries already set. This withdrawal had a profound effect. Without visible overseers, humanity slowly began to test limits again. But it did so cautiously, unconsciously aware that something had gone wrong before. Progress resumed, but with a strange hesitation. Innovation balanced with fear. Curiosity paired with guilt. This internal conflict would define the next era. The reset had worked almost perfectly. Humanity forgot the cycle, forgot the creators, forgot the near-escape attempts of the fourth and fifth civilizations. What it did not forget was the sense that there were lines not to be crossed, that some knowledge was dangerous, that the universe watched, and so the stage was set. The world stabilized just enough for civilization to rise again, but not enough to remember why it had fallen before. This balance is delicate. Too much memory leads to rebellion, too little leads to stagnation. The final reset before us achieved the ideal midpoint, a species capable of growth but unaware of its past failures. From here, everything we call history begins. Empires, religions, science, philosophy, wars, revolutions, all of it unfolds on a foundation built not on truth, but on absence. The absence of deep time, the absence of cycles, the absence of prior worlds, and yet cracks remain. They appear when ancient myths from distant cultures mirror each other too closely, when sacred stories describe events that feel planetary rather than local, when symbols repeat across continents without clear explanation, when humans feel drawn to ruins older than memory, sensing familiarity without understanding why. These cracks are not mistakes, they are residues. The final reset could not erase everything. No reset ever does. It only reduces complexity to a manageable level. And from that reduced state, patterns begin to form again. Curiosity returns, questions emerge, comparisons are made. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, humanity begins to sense that something about its story is incomplete. This is where we now stand. The reset before us did not end history, it rebooted it. And every step we take forward now retraces ground walked before, even if we do not recognize the footprints. Technology accelerates, knowledge expands. The same thresholds approached in earlier cycles come back into view. Energy, intelligence, control over life, control over information, control over reality itself. The difference is that this time we believe it is the first time. That belief is the greatest achievement of the final reset. As we move closer to the present, closer to ourselves, keep this in mind. The world we inherited was designed to feel new. But new does not mean original, and progress does not mean immunity. The reset before us was not the end of the cycle. It was the setup for its most convincing repetition. Before we continue into what it means to be the seventh civilization, take a moment when this section ends and leave a comment. You don't need to explain everything, just write a phrase that stayed with you. Final reset. We forgot on purpose. Linear history is a lie. Or even, this feels familiar. These simple words help this conversation reach others who are sensing the same cracks in the story and they tell me you're still here, following the thread as we move closer to the most uncomfortable part of all, understanding where we are now within the cycle. And now we arrive at the most unsettling part of this journey, not because it speaks about a forgotten past, but because it speaks directly about us. The seventh civilization is not buried beneath oceans or hidden in myth. It is not a whisper in ancient stone or a symbol lost in ritual. The seventh civilization is conscious, connected, technological, and accelerating at a pace no previous cycle ever reached. It is us listening right now, believing we are at the peak of history, while unknowingly standing inside a pattern far older than memory. What defines the seventh civilization is not just technology, but speed. Knowledge no longer unfolds over centuries, but over years, sometimes months. Information spreads instantly. Ideas mutate faster than they can be understood. Humanity is no longer evolving slowly within nature, it is actively rewriting nature. Artificial intelligence mirrors cognition. Genetic tools reshape life. Energy manipulation reaches into the fundamental structure of reality. These are not small steps, these are threshold behaviors. And thresholds are where previous civilizations disappeared. What makes this era especially dangerous is how familiar it feels to the past, even though we believe it is unprecedented. We speak of progress as if it were guaranteed, as if history bends naturally toward improvement. But cycles do not bend. They repeat, and repetition does not announce itself clearly. It disguises itself as innovation, as destiny, as inevitability. The seventh civilization inherited a world designed to forget, yet it is beginning to remember unintentionally. Not through ancient texts alone, but through pattern recognition, through comparison, through technology that allows us to look deeper into time, space, and ourselves. We are rediscovering cycles in climate, in stars, in civilizations. We are noticing that collapse is not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of complex systems. This realization is not mystical, it is structural, and structure does not lie. One of the defining traits of the seventh civilization is its illusion of independence. We believe we are free from gods, myths, and ancient control systems. We believe we have outgrown superstition, and yet control has not vanished. It has evolved. Narratives still dictate what is safe to question. Knowledge is still compartmentalized. Truth is filtered through authority, consensus, and systems of power. The tools are modern, but the architecture is ancient. This is why the seventh civilization feels simultaneously advanced and constrained. We can calculate the age of stars, yet struggle to understand our own origins. We can simulate reality, yet remain uncertain about consciousness. We can manipulate matter at the smallest scales, yet feel increasingly disconnected from meaning. This imbalance is not accidental. It is the echo of controlled reboots layered over time. What is different now is awareness. For the first time since the early cycles, a large portion of humanity is beginning to sense that something about our story does not add up. That history feels compressed, that myths align too neatly across cultures, that progress seems to accelerate toward instability rather than balance. This sensing does not come from belief, but from pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is dangerous to any system built on repetition. The seventh civilization is the first to document itself globally in real time. Every breakthrough, every failure, every signal is recorded, copied, and distributed. This creates a paradox. On one hand, it makes erasure more difficult than ever before. On the other, it amplifies fragility. Systems become interconnected, failures cascade. A local disruption can become global within moments. This level of interdependence has never existed before at this scale, and that raises a critical question. If previous civilizations were erased when they reached dangerous thresholds, what happens when a civilization reaches all thresholds at once? The seventh civilization is not advancing in one direction. It is advancing in all directions simultaneously. Technology, biology, psychology, information, and power are converging. This convergence is what ancient myths described symbolically as humans becoming like gods, not morally, but functionally. Creation, prediction, simulation, control. These are the attributes once reserved for the creators themselves. This is where the cycle tightens, because the creators, the watchers, the architects, whatever form they take, do not respond to morality. They respond to risk. A civilization capable of altering reality itself becomes unpredictable, uncontainable, and unpredictability is the one variable systems seek to eliminate. The seventh civilization also carries a unique vulnerability: distraction. Never before has a civilization been so entertained, so stimulated, and so fragmented in attention. This may not be a flaw, but a feature. A civilization that is constantly distracted does not reflect deeply. It does not integrate knowledge. It consumes instead of contemplates. This slows awareness just enough to allow the cycle to continue unnoticed. And yet, awareness keeps leaking through. It leaks through dreams of collapse, through fascination with lost civilizations, through stories of resets, simulations, loops, and ancient gods returning. These are not random cultural trends. They are subconscious memory surfacing, humanity remembering without knowing what it remembers. The seventh civilization stands at a crossroads no other cycle reached with this level of consciousness. Either it repeats the pattern fully, triggering another reset, or it does something unprecedented. It notices the cycle while still inside it, and that possibility changes everything. Because awareness introduces choice. The most unsettling realization is this: the cycle may not be enforced by an external enemy. It may be enforced by conditions, by thresholds built into reality itself. Civilizations that grow too complex, too powerful, too disconnected from balance may collapse, not because they are punished, but because they become unstable. If that is true, then the creators are not villains. They are observers of a law humanity has not yet learned to respect. And if that is true, the seventh civilization's greatest challenge is not survival, but restraint. We are approaching the same questions asked before. How much knowledge is too much? How fast is too fast? What happens when intelligence outpaces wisdom? These are not philosophical curiosities, they are survival questions. The answers determine whether this civilization becomes another layer of myth, or the first to step outside the cycle. And here is where this story becomes personal. Because the seventh civilization is not defined by governments or technologies alone. It is defined by individuals, by people who pause, who question, who notice patterns instead of accepting narratives. Awareness does not begin at the top. It begins quietly in moments like this, when someone listens and feels that something ancient is being described with unsettling accuracy. As we move forward, we will explore whether the seventh civilization is repeating the same path or diverging from it in subtle ways. But before that, I want to hear from you. At the end of this section, leave a comment with a word or phrase that resonates. Seventh civilization. This is us. We're at the threshold. Or even something simple like, I feel this. These comments matter. They don't just help the video, they mark awareness. And awareness, in every cycle, is where change begins. And this is where the story stops being distant, symbolic, or ancient, and starts feeling uncomfortably close, because the signal of warning does not arrive as fire from the sky or gods descending in thunder. It arrives quietly, embedded in patterns we are already living inside. The most dangerous part of repeating a cycle is never the collapse itself. It is the moment when everything feels normal just before it happens. The signal of alert is not a single event. It is convergence. When civilizations approach their breaking point, history shows the same conditions aligning again and again. Acceleration without reflection, power without wisdom, connectivity without cohesion, knowledge expanding faster than ethical frameworks can adapt. The seventh civilization is not drifting toward these conditions. It is immersed in them. We are surrounded by signs, yet trained to interpret each one as isolated, manageable, temporary. That is how the cycle protects itself. One of the clearest warning signals is speed. Previous civilizations advanced, but never at this rate. Today, entire technological revolutions occur within a single generation. Systems that shape reality, artificial intelligence, surveillance networks, genetic manipulation, algorithmic control of information, are deployed globally before their consequences are understood. This mirrors the final stages of earlier cycles, when tools outpaced comprehension, when capability exceeded restraint. Speed creates blindness. When change moves too fast, societies lose the ability to pause, integrate, and question. Decisions become reactive, ethics become retroactive, and once that threshold is crossed, control no longer belongs to humans. It belongs to systems that evolve on their own momentum. Another warning signal is fragmentation. The seventh civilization is more connected than any before it, yet more divided internally. Information is abundant, but shared understanding is rare. Truth splinters into narratives. Reality becomes personalized, curated, and filtered. This fragmentation weakens collective awareness, and collective awareness is the only defense a civilization has against repeating its own mistakes. In earlier cycles, fragmentation appeared just before collapse. Cultures stopped communicating, knowledge became siloed, power centralized while meaning dissolved. The pattern is unmistakable. A civilization does not fall when it lacks information. It falls when it loses coherence. There is also the signal of dependency. Modern humanity depends on systems it does not fully understand and cannot easily dismantle. Energy grids, digital networks, financial abstractions, automated decision-making. These systems are efficient but fragile. When they fail, they do so catastrophically. Earlier civilizations collapsed when their complexity exceeded their resilience. The seventh civilization has reached a level of complexity that may be impossible to stabilize indefinitely. And then there is the psychological signal, perhaps the most important one. A growing sense of unease. Across cultures, people feel that something is off. Not always consciously, but emotionally. Anxiety without a clear cause, nostalgia for a future that never existed, obsession with apocalyptic scenarios, simulations, resets, lost civilizations, and ancient gods returning. These are not entertainment trends. They are symptoms, signals rising from the collective subconscious, the same place where inherited memory once survived previous resets. Humanity may not remember the past cycles intellectually, but it remembers them instinctively. The signal of alert also appears in how we treat knowledge. Information is weaponized. Truth is politicized. Curiosity is punished socially. Those who ask foundational questions are marginalized or ridiculed. This mirrors the late stages of the sixth civilization, when silence became safety, when staying within approved narratives meant survival. When a civilization begins to fear its own questions, it is already close to repeating history. There is also a deeper, more unsettling signal, the return of the same myths rebranded in modern language. Where ancient cultures spoke of gods and watchers, we speak of simulations and higher intelligences. Where they feared divine judgment, we fear system collapse. Where they warned of forbidden knowledge, we warn of uncontrollable technology. The language has changed, but the structure of the warning is identical. This suggests that the cycle does not care about belief systems. It only responds to conditions, and the conditions are aligning again. The seventh civilization is approaching the same thresholds that triggered previous resets. Control over life, control over intelligence, control over planetary systems, and control over narrative itself. Each threshold alone is manageable. Together, they become destabilizing. History does not reset civilizations because they are evil or corrupt. It resets them because they become unstable. That is the part most people misunderstand. The warning is not moral, it is structural. A civilization that grows too complex without balance collapses under its own weight. A civilization that centralizes too much power becomes brittle. A civilization that accelerates without reflection outruns its ability to adapt. These are not punishments, they are consequences. And here is the most dangerous signal of all: confidence, the belief that this time is different. Every civilization believes it is smarter than the last, more advanced, more prepared, more ethical. The fourth and fifth civilizations believed this too. They believed awareness would save them, knowledge would protect them, technology would give them control. And yet they underestimated the system they were operating within. The seventh civilization is repeating this belief almost perfectly. We trust our models, our predictions, our safeguards. We believe collapse is something that happens to others in other times, under other conditions. But collapse does not announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as progress pushed just a little too far. And still, there is something different now. For the first time, the signal of alert is being noticed before the collapse, not by institutions or authorities, but by individuals. People sensing patterns, questioning linear history, feeling that humanity has been here before. This awareness is fragmented, scattered, and often dismissed, but it exists, and existence matters. Because cycles can only repeat fully when they are unconscious. The signal of alert is not telling us that collapse is inevitable. It is telling us that repetition is likely unless something changes, and change does not require stopping progress. It requires integrating wisdom with capability, slowing where acceleration blinds, questioning where certainty numbs, remembering where forgetting feels safe. The warning signs are not meant to frighten, they are meant to awaken. And that awakening does not happen all at once. It happens in quiet moments, in realizations like this one, in the recognition that the story of humanity is bigger, older, and more fragile than we were taught. That being the seventh civilization is not a badge of honor. It is a responsibility, because if we are repeating the same path, then the end will look familiar. But if we recognize the pattern while still inside it, then the path itself can change. Before we go any further, before we move into what comes next, pause here with me. I want to know what this section stirred in you. At the end, leave a comment with a word or phrase that feels right. Warning signs, same cycle, we're close, history repeating, or even something simple like this feels real. These comments are more than engagement. They are signals too. Signals that awareness is spreading, quietly, individually, and just in time to matter. If you stayed with me until the very end of this journey, that already tells me something important about you. It means you didn't just listen. You followed, you reflected, and you allowed these ideas to settle in. And that kind of attention matters more than you might realize. If this story made you question history, cycles, and our place as the seventh civilization, take a moment right now and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is how you make sure these long, calm, thought-provoking journeys into forgotten civilizations, ancient resets, and hidden patterns continue to reach you, especially when you're looking to relax, think, and drift into deeper reflection. If you reach the end, I'd really like you to leave a comment. You don't need to write much. Just comment one of these phrases so I know you were here until the last moment. Seventh civilization, the cycle continues, or we've been here before. Those simple words help this video reach others who are ready to see history from a different perspective. And if this video helped you relax, think, or see the past in a new way, leave a like. That small gesture tells the algorithm that calm, deep storytelling like this deserves space in a world that moves too fast. Before you go, don't stop here. The next video is appearing on your screen right now, and it dives even deeper into what may happen next if the cycle truly continues. Click it, stay curious, and keep this journey going.